There is a moment, you've probably felt it, when you look at something and something shifts inside you. It might be a building, a painting, a piece of music, a face. You don't choose the feeling. It arrives before thought. We call it beauty. But here's what's strange. If you ask 10 people why something is beautiful, you get 10 different answers. And yet, across cultures, across centuries, across every civilization that has ever existed, certain things have consistently been called beautiful. Which raises a question we rarely take seriously enough. Is beauty really in the eye of the beholder? Or is something else happening? Welcome to 1% More. One video. 1% more than you knew before. Philosophers have been arguing about beauty for over 2,000 years. Plato thought it was divine, a glimpse of perfect, eternal forms beyond the physical world. Kant thought it was a feeling of harmony between the world and the structures of our mind. The Romantics thought it was about the sublime, the overwhelming, almost terrifying encounter with nature. And then, in the 20th century, we mostly gave up on the question. We decided beauty was relative, personal, subjective. Different strokes for different people. End of conversation. But in the last 30 years, something interesting happened. Neuroscientists, evolutionary biologists, and psychologists started studying aesthetic experience in the lab. And what they found challenges the idea that beauty is simply a matter of opinion. It turns out we are not as free in what we find beautiful as we think we are. Let's start with what the brain actually does when it encounters beauty. When we perceive something aesthetically pleasing, several regions of the brain activate simultaneously, including the visual cortex, the reward circuits, and areas associated with emotional processing. One of these regions is the medial orbitofrontal cortex, a part of the brain that also activates when we eat something delicious or receive unexpected good news. In other words, beauty, at a neurological level, feels like a reward. But why would the brain reward the experience of looking at a painting, or a sunset, or a well-designed chair? The answer, evolutionary biologists suggest, goes back much further than art. Consider symmetry. Across virtually every human culture, symmetrical faces are considered more attractive. This is not a coincidence. Symmetry is a reliable indicator of genetic health. A face that develops symmetrically is a face whose DNA replicated cleanly, without the errors that disease or stress introduce. Our ancestors who found symmetrical faces attractive had more healthy offspring. The preference was selected for. It is now wired into us. The same logic applies to landscapes. In the 1980s, researchers discovered something called the savanna hypothesis. When people from different cultures, including people who had never left dense urban environments, were shown images of different landscapes, they consistently preferred open, grassy terrain with scattered trees, proximity to water, and gentle elevation changes. That is, almost exactly, the East African savanna where Homo sapiens evolved. We are drawn to the environment where our species learned to survive. But here is where it gets more interesting. This is not just about faces and landscapes. Researchers studying art across cultures found consistent preferences for certain compositional structures, the use of contrast, the balance between complexity and simplicity, the presence of a clear focal point. When people with no formal art training were shown abstract images and asked to rate them, they reliably preferred compositions that follow principles that artists have understood intuitively for millennia: proportion, balance, tension, and resolution. These are not arbitrary rules invented by art schools. They appear to map onto something in how the perceptual system processes information. The brain prefers images that are organized, complex enough to be interesting, but not so chaotic that they overwhelm processing. There is a word for this in cognitive science: fluency. The easier an image is for the brain to process, while still offering enough complexity to hold attention, the more pleasurable the experience of looking at it tends to be. Beauty, on this account, is partially a measure of cognitive efficiency. But if beauty were purely biological, purely a product of evolution, then taste would never change. And taste does change. The same cultures that once considered obesity a sign of beauty and health now consider it the opposite. The European Renaissance idealized pale skin. Today, other aesthetics prevail. The Baroque period covered every surface with gold and ornament. The 20th century stripped everything bare and called it elegant. So which is it? Is beauty hardwired, or is it cultural? The answer is both, and the interaction between the two is more interesting than either alone. Think of it this way. Evolutionary pressures gave us a set of aesthetic predispositions, a foundation. But culture builds on top of that foundation in remarkably different ways, depending on environment, history, religion, technology, and economics. Consider the history of the color white in architecture. For centuries, we assumed that the great temples of ancient Greece, the Parthenon, the Acropolis, were white, pure, clean, austere, that whiteness became associated with ideals of Western civilization, reason, clarity, order. It influenced everything: neoclassical architecture, modernism, the Apple Store. Then, in the 20th century, archaeologists discovered something that upended all of it. The temples were never white. They were covered in vivid, almost garish polychrome paint, reds, blues, yellows. The Greeks painted their gods in full color. The pristine white we associated with classical ideals was simply the result of paint fading over 2,000 years. An entire aesthetic tradition, centuries of architecture and design, was built on a misreading of ruins. This tells us something important. What we find beautiful is shaped, more than we realize, by what we have been told is beautiful, by what we have been exposed to, by the stories a culture tells about itself through its art. And yet, even knowing this, the reconstructed painted Parthenon still feels slightly wrong to eyes trained on the white version. That feeling is real. It is not nothing. It suggests that aesthetic taste, once formed, goes deep. It becomes part of how we see. So let's return to the question we started with. Is beauty in the eye of the beholder? Here is what I think the evidence actually suggests. There are layers to aesthetic experience. At the deepest layer, the one we share across cultures and across time, there are genuine universals, preferences that emerged from millions of years of evolution and that no amount of cultural conditioning fully erases. Above that sits culture, the specific, historical contingent layer that teaches us what counts as sophisticated, what counts as crude, what is in taste and what is not. This layer varies enormously, and it can override the biological layer. We can learn to find beautiful what we were once taught to ignore, and to ignore what we were once taught to find beautiful. But here is the part that tends to get lost in both accounts. Beauty is not a property of objects. It is a relationship. It happens in the encounter between a particular nervous system, shaped by evolution and personal history, and a particular object, embedded in a particular cultural moment. This means that when two people disagree about whether something is beautiful, they are not simply expressing different preferences, as if beauty were like preferring coffee to tea. They are, quite literally, having different experiences. The philosopher John Dewey called this aesthetic experience, a moment when perception becomes unusually alive, when the ordinary act of looking becomes something richer. Not every encounter with a beautiful thing produces this. Sometimes it requires time, attention, knowledge, context. A person who knows nothing about jazz may hear only noise. The same passage, heard by someone who understands its harmonic structure and emotional history, can be overwhelming. This is not elitism. It is simply the recognition that aesthetic experience, like all experience, depends on what you bring to it. And what you bring to it can always be expanded. That is, perhaps, the most important thing to understand about beauty. It is not fixed. It is not given. It is something you can cultivate. The next time you find yourself stopped in front of something, a building, a painting, a face, a late afternoon sky, consider that the feeling you are having is the result of a conversation that has been going on for a very long time, between your biology and your history, between the object in front of you and everything you have ever been taught to see, between what is universal in you and what is entirely your own. That conversation is what beauty is, and it is worth paying attention to.